Welcome to the Real Bible Rob podcast. Today I'd like to talk about probably the most divisive issue that people think is a biblical issue in today's politics, and that is transgender people and how we deal with them and how we deal with the issues surrounding them. It's really heartbreaking, honestly, because transgender people are being used as and targeted as political pawns by the media, especially in Christian media. And you'd think, you hear about people saying, well, they're shoving this down my throat, or all I hear about is transgender, and I never heard about transgender as a young person. Were there really any transgender people, 40, 50 years ago? Well, the reason why they say things like this is because in certain media spheres, transgender people are talked about 10 times more, 20 times more than in other spheres because they have become a hot button issue. And we're talking about maybe 1% of the population. Very convenient target group for outrage. There was I heard about a post on the New York Post did an article about a transgender woman who was a migrant who was teaching children and doing something awful. And it's just like boom, 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 hits all of the right-wing media hot points in one. And whenever I post things about transgender people on social media, which I do occasionally, I'll get hundreds of thousands, if not millions of views, and I'll get thousands of comments, and some of them are just awful. I would say most of them are they're brutal, they're horrible, and they say that, I'm against God and all of that, and they can't do anything. They can't use scripture to support them at all. So it's just basically hate mongering, and we have to find a way to, how does scriptures deal with this? Is it a real issue or not? So I'd like to kind of get into that. I'll talk about three scriptures actually, but the main ones are Genesis 1:27. People use this all the time. And then Deuteronomy 22:5. They use that against transgender people. And then I'm going to skip forward to Matthew 19:10 through 12, when Jesus talks about eunuchs and how this is an interesting way of considering what the scripture really say. So let's get into it. First of all, we'll talk about what is these couple of scriptures. Then we'll talk about what the sort of the hypocrisy is around changing people, changing the body, and how that doesn't really fit, that it's being picked out, and then how we should protect and defend transgender people. And that's really the gospel message, is how do we help people who are vulnerable? And like I said, maybe 1% of the population. So the couple of verses, there are many that are kind of conflated into it, and it's surrounded with LGBTQ stuff, and it none of it really fits. But the two main verses that people use against transgender people are in the Old Testament. And the first one is Genesis 1:27. So God created humans in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. So he created them male and female. So most people take this, and they also take Genesis 2:24, which is about man and woman cleaving to each other in relationship in what people call marriage. And say, well, yeah, so there's only men and there's only women. There's only male and female. It's right there. God says so. So let's talk about this a little bit. First of all, this is in the creation story. This is all about parallelism, right? This is this idea of Hebrew scripture and poetry often repeats itself slightly different. And you see one example of that here. You'll see it throughout this. And this is also looking back. This is people in the Probably, in the, oh, I don't know, whenever whenever Genesis was pulled together, which is probably 600 to 400 BCE, people looking back and saying, okay, well, this is the creation story. How do we best describe it? And if you look and know anything about Hebrew poetry, there's something called merism. And this is the idea of boundaries. And you see it all over in Hebrew scripture where you talk about the left and the right, the top and the bottom. You talk about male and female. Now, if you take this as an exclusionary thing, saying there's only male, there's only female, you're reading in your Western bias into this Hebrew scripture. This description is about male and female and how God has created the fullness of humanity. Uh, most people who know Hebrew and a lot of people, Jewish people, especially in recent centuries, have looked back at this in the Jewish Midrash, in all kinds of studies, and realized that when we're talking about the creation story, we're talking about God creating a human. And that human, and there's two different accounts. There's the one in this case right here, talking about being created as male and female from the beginning. In chapter 2, we're talking about Adam being created. Adam's lonely. God creates Eve from Adam. So these can be either considered in conflict or not in conflict. It kind of doesn't matter. They're really two ways of approaching the creation story. But in the first case here, this merism is the idea of using boundaries to describe the whole, very common in the Hebrew scriptures. So you can't really pull out a gender binary, a strict gender binary from Genesis 1:27 if you're faithful to the Hebrew and the Hebrew scriptures. It just doesn't exist there. If you go to the chapter 2 and you're talking about the creation of Adam and then Eve and how that was done, you have to also realize that, well, was Adam created genderless to begin with? Because God created Adam, and then Eve comes out of Adam, and there's a whole bunch of complication there. Well, what causes this binary here? Was the binary not there and then became the binary? Was Adam split? There's a lot of complication in this. And so again, to be able to pull this out, it's descriptive. It says, oh, well, there's men and there's women. There are two genders which can produce children, and that's what these stories describe. So that must have been how God created us. Well, yeah, okay, good. And that's true, because, the large majority of people are heterosexual. The large majority of people have clear gender identities. The very large majority of people have genitals that match their gender identity, their sexuality, and everything. Because that's the way it is. But does it say that all people must fit into this? This has been dealt with a number of ways. In Judaism, there have been identified over the centuries 6 different gender roles, because there is more of a continuum, and we all know this. We know this from biology, from history, from social interaction and everything, is that we know that some people are very, very male, some people are very, very female, and then some people are male who have feminine qualities. There are females who have male qualities. There are people who are intersex. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with people who are biologically intersex? How do you deal with people who have firm identities that don't match what their genitals are? And that's always been the case. And we see a lot of examples of that actually in Scripture. It's nothing is explicit because we don't talk about, Scripture doesn't have identities that we have come to realize, nor does Scripture have the idea of self-determination or autonomy of the body either. Things that we cherish in our society. So you just can't map one on top of the other. That's why it's fallacious to use Genesis 1:27 or Genesis 2:24 for to talk about saying that God doesn't like transgender people. Then the other verse that people have picked out, and that is Deuteronomy 22:5, and it says, "A woman shall not wear a man's garment, nor shall a man put on a woman's cloak. For whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord your God." Oh my goodness, so cross-dressing is an abomination? Really? It's that bad? Well, you have to pluck this out. Why isn't this in Genesis, or why isn't this in Leviticus if it's so important? Well, it isn't in those contexts. What it's important here, and when you're talking about Deuteronomy 22, is you're talking about most likely, this is a military discussion. Most likely, what was happening was the northern tribes were coming down, especially Hittites, Hittites and Assyrians who had conquered the northern kingdom, who were threatening Jerusalem. And there are two sides of this. One is that in Hittite culture and other cultures like this, the strict binary about how people dressed, and especially in temple practices and things like that, weren't as rigid as the Hebrews. And they were saying, don't do that. Don't be like Hittites. The other part of it is military, is that it was a common practice, especially when you use the word cloak. This is something that the ESV, the English Standard Version, which I usually think is a pretty bad translation, actually gets right. They emphasize that the word for a woman's garment is closer to that of a cloak. So why is that important for a man not to wear a woman's cloak? Well, because in military history, you can hide weapons in a cloak. And that was very common. It said, you don't do that, because what you do, you're a threat. If you allow people to do that, then they can get into your camp. They can hide their weapons in a cloak. So that's probably what that is. In any case, Deuteronomy 22 has nothing to do with transgender people. It has nothing to do with the kind of what we would consider cross-dressing and stuff like that. In fact, if you look in the Hebrew Bible, if you look at Joseph, for example, he wears the ketonet pasim, which is the multicolored robe. Well, ketonet pasim is a feminine word. It's a woman's dress. It shows up with Tamar. She wears the ketonet pasim too. And this is the clearest example of cross-dressing in the Old Testament. There's lots of things about Joseph. There's lots of things about David and Jonathan and others that, how they dressed, how they interacted with each other, that we would consider scandalous if you are, if you're really worried about people cross-dressing or people and their gender identity. It's just ridiculous to use these verses this way. Now, one of the main arguments that people will use in saying, well, God created man and woman. It's a sin to, mutilate the body. You hear that all the time. Are you saying, one of the things I heard is, God, are you saying that God didn't create us the way we are supposed to be? He makes mistakes? This is totally fallacious, because you're saying then if a child is born with a cleft palate, if a child is born intersex, if a child is born with a congenital heart defect, are you saying that God made a mistake and you shouldn't perform surgery on them? Come on. It's ridiculous. It's totally fallacious. And then if you say, oh, well, yeah, but no, trans people are choosing to do this. Well, And those are babies, right? And that's, we really ought to do stuff for that. Well, okay, but body modification happens all the time. We do that all the time. We dress ourselves up to be how we want to be seen. We wear makeup. We wear, we do things like get tattoos. Is that, well, according to, Levitical law, you don't want to get tattoos. That's not good, but people get them all the time. In fact, if you look at the typical Christian pastor today, he's got tattoos all over himself. Is he, an abomination? Is he modifying his body in a way that's dishonoring God and mocking God? Oh, come on. Ridiculous. What about elective plastic surgery? I mean, come on. People do this all the time. People get, they pierce their ears to put earrings in. People have done this throughout human history. They modify their body for their identity in order to project an image, to show who they are. This is part of the bodily autonomy that most modern people hold in, very high regard. Don't tell me what to do with my body. If, somebody, I'm an individual, right? But it seems that Christian people think, oh yeah, don't do anything to my body as long as I can tell you what to do with your body. And that's what this really is. It's all about control. Then people will say, well, yeah, but genitals are different. How can you mutilate the genitals? Well, first of all, there's two things here. One is not all transgender people get gender-affirming surgery or get transition surgery. Not all do. Some do, some don't. Some get top surgery, some get both bottom surgery and top surgery. Some people never get it. Some people go the whole way. It just doesn't fit because they say, well, but genitals are different. You can't mutilate the body. Well, circumcision is literal genital mutilation, and it's literally biblical. Come on. But God commanded to do circumcision. Circumcision is about identity. Circumcision was done so that the Israelites could be identified as being separate, devoted to God. It's genital mutilation in order to show their devotion to God. It's, people have done this throughout history. You see this all the time. People get, all different cultures around the world get piercings, tattoos, all kinds of different, you go to Africa today and you get, and some of it's egregious because that genital mutilation actually really hurts people and it's done without consent. But, is circumcision done without consent? Yes, circumcision is done without consent. And it is genital mutilation, or it's genital altering. And, so these arguments make no sense whatsoever. And they're just used to cherry pick and pull out and find ways to hurt transgender people. And like I said, if we just left transgender people alone, gave them bodily autonomy, allowed, if they're minors, nobody's getting surgery at age 14 or 15, right? They may get hormone suppression drugs, or they may, and they can identify, or they wear clothing or whatever, or they get counseling as teenagers. But this, thing that there's this big cabal and that, we're mutilating our teenagers is just nonsense. Leave that to the person, their parents, their doctors, and their religious leaders. Stay out of it. It's not any of your business, fellow Christian. Stay out of it. It's not your business. Leave them alone. Don't terrorize people for what they're dealing with. Now, you say, well, how many, like I said, transgender people are a very small minority in America. I've known a handful, and, I'm in ministry. So, I've met and dealt with thousands of people, A very small handful. I only know two transgender people today that in which I have like a personal relationship with, and it's it's just that there aren't many people like that. These two people are wonderful people. I'm so glad I know them. I really care for them. Um, I've seen their journeys, and I feel like I have a better understanding of what that feels like for them. I don't know what it feels like inside of me because I have not had any gender challenges or challenges with how I present or anything like that. But and most people don't, but some people do. But they call it gender. Some people call it gender dysphoria. That is fallacious. There is gender dysphoria, but most of the people I have worked with, most transgender people do not have gender dysphoria. They just simply have an identity, and they have a desire to be of a different gender than they present. It's just the way it is. So this is there's nothing really in Scripture about this at all. And like I said, you have to pick these couple of things, Genesis 1:27 and Deuteronomy 22:5, in order to make it so. And it's so dishonest. It hurts my heart whenever I see this happen. So let's talk about the other side of this. What's the closest thing in Scripture to somebody who is a minority, a hated minority about gender? And that is eunuchs. Now, eunuchs in ancient societies often had no choice. They didn't have the ability to choose whether they would be eunuchs or not. They were usually taken into the courts, into the king's court or into royalty, because they're safe, right? If you want to have someone who is totally, that's submissive and can do courtly work without having to worry about them being a threat, a sexual threat, especially around the queen, or around women. Well, you make them eunuchs. Now, Jesus talks about eunuchs in Matthew 19. Now, it's a little Jesus' context here is a little out of the context of what it means to be a eunuch, because he's talking about marriage, and he's talking about how the Pharisees were trying to trap him into saying that they could divorce for no reason. And Jesus is saying, well, no, you can't, because you have to protect the woman. In that world, if you divorced a woman, remember, this is in Rome, the Roman Empire period where Jesus was, polygamy was illegal. So you couldn't just marry another woman if your woman was infertile. That's what this story is really about. So the Pharisees saying, wait a minute, if I can't divorce my wife, I'm stuck with her, right? I can't do that. This was a very political thing, because they hated, the Pharisees, the temple hierarchy hated that aspect of the Roman Empire, that you couldn't do polygamy. And they hated it. So they were trying to trap Jesus. So Jesus comes back with part of his retort. He talks about eunuchs. It's in fact the only time that Jesus talks about eunuchs. And he says this, he says, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it's better they'd not marry at all. In other words, Jesus is saying, if you're gonna, reject a woman, just don't. You make a commitment and you make it for life. That's what Jesus is saying here. But he said, but not everyone can accept this teaching, but only to those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth. Aha. People who are intersex, he's talking about them, and those people have always existed. He's talking about people who have or don't have the ability to have children. They don't have their testicles aren't working, their sexual organs aren't working. Okay, they've been born that way. And then there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. Okay, these are the people who have been maybe enslaved, and they were made eunuchs. They were castrated in order to be taken into the court. And then there are those who made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. Now, this could be people who are especially devout. There are people who, apparently there were people who were castrated because they didn't want to have any conflict with that, and they devoted themselves. They have like a monk-like appearance, or a monk-like life. They did that. They wanted to remain celibate. And he says, let anyone accept this who can. Jesus is saying, accept them. Accept the ones that are intersex from birth. Accept the slaves that were made eunuchs. Accept the ones that decided to do it because they wanted to be in the king's court, or because they wanted to be devoted to God, or whatever. He's saying, accept them. They're human beings. Accept them. What do we not get about this, right? He's saying that he doesn't say anything against these people at all. So this is just an example of kind of like, mind your own business. People have different purposes for what their bodies do and how they use them. And if they're not hurting other people, they're not hurting a relationship with God, and they're not hurting themselves if they're being true to themselves. And that's where I think this scripture is relevant. Now, in ancient Hebrew times, they may not have had this grace that Jesus shows in this passage. And it happens many times where Jesus kind of breaks the rules a little bit. At least the rules interpreted according to the Pharisees and the religious bullies, basically. And he's saying, stop it. So that's what I would say to people who use transgender identity and all of this discussion. Stop it. Jesus, what would Jesus do? Jesus would tell you, accept them, get over it, and don't spend 10 times, 20 times, 50 times talking about it in right-wing media as a political avatar. It is the most unfair thing. It is the worst thing possible. If you know transgender people, if you live with them, if you spend any time with them, they are in fear because they know they're being targeted, especially in this environment today. And they know how unfair it is and how they're being treated. Don't do it. And never, and really, really, don't use scripture against them. This is taking the Lord's name in vain, is to misrepresent what scripture is and what the gospel is. So with that, I'll say, people say lots of things about the Bible, especially about transgender people, that aren't really there. Not at all. And I say, God bless you.